To understand the light, one must first be intimately acquainted with the dark. Before she was a master of luminosity, Ruth Bernhard was a child of shadows. Not the frightening kind, but the quiet, pervasive shadows of loneliness and solitude that often forge the fiercest imaginations. Her story begins in Berlin at the dawn of the 20th century, a city that was a throbbing engine of art, industry, and intellect. But inside her home, the atmosphere was different. She was born into a world where creativity was the currency, yet affection was a rare commodity. Her father was a titan of the design world, a man whose posters and typefaces would define an era of graphic minimalism. He was a figure of monolithic importance, a sun around whom the household orbited. But for a young girl, a father who is a son can be blinding. He was distant, consumed by his own genius, leaving her to navigate the treacherous waters of a fractured family. Her parents separated while she was still a toddler, a rupture that defined her early emotional landscape. She was not raised in the warm embrace of a nuclear family, but was passed between grandmothers and teachers, growing up in a boarding school environment that prioritized discipline over tenderness. It was a life of rigid structures and high expectations. In this isolation, she learned her first and most vital lesson: how to observe. When there is no one to talk to, you watch. You watch how dust motes dance in a shaft of afternoon sun. You watch the texture of a velvet chair. You watch the way rain distorts the view through a window pane. She didn't know it then, but she was already training her eye. She was learning to find company in the inanimate. She was not a scholar in the traditional sense. The rigid rote learning of the German school system chafed against her intuitive nature. She was a disappointing student to those who measured intelligence by grades, but she possessed a feral curiosity about the world. She tried to fit the mold, attending an art academy to study the things a daughter of a famous artist should study, but the academic approach to art felt sterile to her. She drifted, a boat without a rudder, knowing there was a creative force inside her, but lacking the vessel to carry it. The trajectory of a life is often altered by the smallest of accidents. In the late 1920s, she followed her father to New York City. America was the land of jazz, steel, and velocity, a stark contrast to the brooding history of Berlin. She was a young woman in a new world, trying to find a footing in the shadow of her father, who was now conquering American advertising just as he had conquered German design. She needed a job. She needed a purpose. She found herself working in the darkroom of a magazine, a lowly assistant amidst the chemicals and the fumes. It was unglamorous work, yet there was magic in it. Watching an image emerge from the white void of photographic paper, a ghost manifesting in the developer tray, touched something primal in her. It was alchemy. However, her employment was short-lived. She was let go, told she didn't have the aptitude for the work. It was a rejection that could have ended her journey before it began. Instead, it sparked a defiant intuition. With the severance pay from the job that fired her, she did something illogical. She bought a camera. It was not a sleek handheld device. It was a large, cumbersome view camera, a machine of bellows and wood that required a tripod and patience. She didn't buy it because she had a burning desire to be a photographer in the professional sense. She bought it because she needed a way to speak, and words had always failed her. Her English was still developing, her shyness was crippling, but the lens offered a buffer. It was a shield and a bridge. Her father was unimpressed. He saw photography as a mechanical trade, beneath the dignity of true art like painting or design. He told her she would never make a living at it, but his doubt was fuel. For the first time, she had something that was hers alone. She began to photograph the small things, objects found in the five and dime stores, vegetables, simple textures. She approached them not as items to be catalogued, but as mysteries to be solved. She had no formal training in lighting, so she learned by trial and error, moving lamps around the room, watching how a shadow could obliterate a shape or give it volume. She was teaching herself the language of light. If New York gave her the tool, California gave her the vision. In the 1930s, she traveled west. It was there, on the sun-drenched coast, that a meeting occurred which would shatter her previous understanding of her craft. She met a man who was arguably the greatest photographer of the era, a man who photographed peppers with the same erotic intensity that he photographed lovers. She had been working as a commercial photographer, taking competent, functional pictures to pay the bills. She showed this man her portfolio. He looked through her work, images of children, commercial assignments, tentative experiments. Then he showed her his. It was a thunderclap. For the first time, she saw that photography was not merely about recording reality, it was about interpreting it. She saw that a photograph could be an emotional event. His work possessed a purity and a rhythmic perfection that brought her to tears. It was an awakening. She realized that until that moment she had been looking at the world, but she hadn't been seeing it. This encounter liberated her. It gave her permission to take the medium seriously as an art form. She realized that her father was wrong. A machine could indeed produce art, providing the soul operating it was awake. She stopped trying to please editors and clients and started trying to please the demanding voice of her own intuition. She moved to the West Coast permanently. The light there was different, sharper, more spiritual. She began to shed the layers of commercial necessity. She wasn't interested in journalism. She didn't care about documenting the news or the fleeting moments of the street. She wanted to document the eternal. She wanted to stop time, not capture it running. It was in the quiet of her studio that she found her true subject, the landscape of the human form. She approached the nude not as a voyeur, and certainly not with the predatory gaze that dominated much of the art world. She approached the body as a landscape, no different from a sand dune or a canyon. To her, a curve of the hip was a melodic line. The arch of a back was a study in tension and release. She worked slowly, painstakingly slowly, in a world that was becoming increasingly obsessed with the snapshot and the decisive moment. She moved at the speed of a glacier. A single session could last hours. She would have her models, often friends or dancers, hold difficult poses until their muscles trembled, seeking that precise moment when the form settled into perfection. She was obsessed with the idea of containment. She often placed her subjects in enclosed spaces, pressing them against boundaries, folding limbs into geometric puzzles. This wasn't about entrapment, it was about concentration. By compressing the form, she felt she was distilling the energy of the life force. She wanted to see how the organic softness of skin interacted with the rigid geometry of the world. And then there was the light. She didn't just illuminate her subjects. She caressed them with lumens. She treated light as a physical substance, something she could mold like clay. She would spend hours adjusting a single spotlight, moving it a fraction of an inch to change the way a shadow fell across a collarbone. She believed that light was the music of the visual world. If the composition was the lyrics, the light was the melody that made you feel it. Her images from this period are characterized by a profound silence. There is no noise in her work, no background distractions, no clutter, just the interplay of black, white, and gray. She stripped away identity, often hiding the faces of her subjects, not to dehumanize them, but to universalize them. She wanted the viewer to see woman or humanity, not a specific person with a specific name. She was searching for the archetype, the eternal symbol hidden within the flesh. Her genius was not limited to the human form. She possessed a childlike wonder for the inanimate. While other photographers were traveling to war zones or scaling mountains, she was finding entire universes in a seashell or a dry leaf. She collected things. Her home was a sanctuary of found objects, bones, rocks, dolls, driftwood. To the average eye, it was clutter. To her, it was a library of forms. She would pick up a dead bird found on the sidewalk and see not a tragedy, but a beautiful, final gesture of flight. She would photograph it with the reverence usually reserved for religious icons. This was the core of her philosophy. Everything has a spirit. She believed that if you looked at something long enough, with enough love and attention, it would eventually reveal its secret to you. She treated a piece of crumpled paper with the same respect she gave a living model. In her eyes, there was no hierarchy of importance. A Grand Canyon and a garden snail were equal in the eyes of the light. This perspective was deeply spiritual. She didn't subscribe to organized religion, but she lived her life with the devotion of a monk. Photography was her prayer, the darkroom was her chapel. The act of developing a print, of watching the image rise from the chemistry, remained a miracle to her until the very end. She often spoke of the little things being the most important. In a century defined by loud noises, wars, bombs, political shouting, she championed the whisper. For a long time, she was a photographer's photographer, respected by her peers, but largely unknown to the general public. She struggled financially for decades. The art world was a boys' club, and the galleries were slow to accept a woman who photographed nudes with such abstract, sculptural power. But she was stubborn. She refused to compromise her vision for commercial success. She lived simply, often frugally, prioritizing her freedom over comfort. As she aged, a new role emerged, that of the teacher. She didn't teach technical skills. She didn't care if her students knew the chemical formula of the developer or the physics of optics. She taught them how to be. Her workshops became legendary, not for the camera tips, but for the life lessons. She would tell her students to disconnect from the chaos of the world and reconnect with their own intuition. She challenged them to say yes. She believed that most people walk around saying no to life, blocking experiences, judging things before they understood them, closing their eyes to the beauty in the mundane. She taught the philosophy of the yes. Yes to the difficult light. Yes to the strange object. Yes to the vulnerability of the artist. She was a tough mentor. She could be brutally honest. But she was driven by a desire to wake people up. She wanted her students to understand that the photograph is a mirror. If you are empty inside, your photographs will be empty, no matter how expensive your camera is. If you are full of curiosity and love, your images will vibrate with it. She lived a very long life, spanning the entirety of the 20th century. She saw the rise and fall of empires, the birth of the atomic age, the digital revolution, yet her work remained timeless. A photograph she took in 1934 looked as modern in 1994 as it did the day it was made. This was because she never chased trends. She anchored her work in the eternal truths of form and light, which do not age. In her later years, the world finally caught up with her. Museums began to collect her work in earnest. Books were published. She became a matriarch of the medium, a living link to the golden age of modernism. But she remained humble, often surprised by the fuss. To her, she was still just that little girl in Berlin looking for a connection. She never stopped seeing. Even when her body grew frail, her eyes remained ferocious. She lived into her second century, a centenarian who had outlived her critics, her peers, and even the era that made her. Her personal life, much like her photography, was unconventional. She loved deeply and independently, refusing to be tied down by the domestic expectations placed on women of her generation. She found partnership and love, but she always maintained a fierce autonomy. She understood that for an artist, solitude is not a curse, but a necessary nutrient. What is the legacy of such a life? It is not merely the prints left behind in museum archives, it is the philosophy she imparted. She taught us that the ordinary is extraordinary. She showed us that a body is not just an object of desire, but a vessel of sacred geometry. She proved that you do not need to travel to the ends of the earth to find beauty. You only need to open your eyes in your own living room. She bridged the gap between the classicism of Europe and the modernism of America. She brought a sense of discipline and structure to the wild freedom of the West Coast, but most importantly, she brought heart. In a medium that can often be cold and mechanical, she infused warmth. She treated the camera not as a machine that takes, but as an instrument that gives. She gave dignity to the discarded, grace to the awkward, and immortality to the fleeting. Her life story is a testament to the power of intuition. She didn't plan her career. She felt her way through it, step by step, following the light. She ignored the voices that told her no. The father who doubted her, the bosses who fired her, the society that ignored her. She listened instead to the quiet voice inside that said, "Look at this. Isn't it beautiful?" In the end, her life was her greatest work of art. It was a composition of patience, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to beauty. She reminds us that we are all photographers in a sense, framing our reality with every glance. The question she leaves us with is not what camera we use, but how we choose to see. Do we see the shadows, or do we, like her, choose to spend a century chasing the light?